Okay. Hey, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I am Susan Danziger and of the Spark of Hudson and also Wally Farms. We are thrilled to bring the second part two of Climate Crisis 101. And I'm particularly delighted because I get to introduce Albert today, who is, if you don't know Albert, he is I guess a managing partner at Union Square Ventures, also co-founder of Spark of Hudson and Wally Farms, and perhaps more importantly, the father of my children.
Most importantly.
And husband. So I'm going to hand it over to Albert for part two of Climate Crisis 101.
Well, hello, everybody. This is a nice, comfortable small group. So feel free to chime in with questions anytime. You can, type something in the chat or even talk on audio if you want to. So this is, as Susan mentioned, this is sort of part two of this talk about the climate crisis. There'll be a part three. And there also was a part one. And I'm going to just start with a basically minimalist recap of part one, which is part one was all about explaining what the planetary greenhouse effect is and how greenhouse gases work. These talks, by the way, the goal of them is not to give you all the answers. The goal is to try and leave you with some principles, some foundations that hopefully will enable you to make more sense of all the things you read and also maybe question some of the things that you read. This is a chart we went over last time. It kind of shows sun rays coming in. It shows them warming up the Earth, and then the sort of orange arrows are the warmth trying to escape into outer space, and that warmth hits these greenhouse gases. On the left, we have carbon dioxide. Then slightly to the right, we have water vapor, and then even further over, we have methane. And what those greenhouse gases do is that they take some of that heat and reflect it right back down to us. And so it kind of stays inside of the atmospheric system. So that's what we covered last time. And then the other thing we covered last time a little bit is that the two major greenhouse gases, as you can see on the earlier slide, that we are really concerned about are carbon dioxide and methane. And this is a different way of presenting why these are the two that we care about. What you can see on this chart here is basically a bar to the right. A brown bar means it makes things hotter. A bar to the left means it makes things cooler. And these are all based on sort of human activity for the most part here. And what you can see at the bottom here is net human activity net human activity is very much warming. That's why the bar is to the right. And you can see that the two most important parts of human activity that contribute to this warming are our contributions to carbon dioxide and to methane in the atmosphere. So here's also a chart that we had seen last time. And this is a chart that shows what the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was like over a 10,000 year period. And you can see that it was relatively stable for most of those 10,000 years. And then it's basically going vertically up in the industrial age. And I'm sorry to say the graph for methane basically looks extremely similar, very, very stable for a very long period of time, and then basically a vertical spike up. So now we might look at these graphs and essentially panic because it just feels like there's nothing we could possibly do. I mean, look at these. They're just going vertically up. What is it that we could possibly be doing? How can we possibly solve this? This seems truly, truly daunting. But in order to understand that, I want to talk about something really different for a moment and then connect it back up. And the really different thing I want to talk about are bus stops. And you may go, how could that be possibly related? But just bear with me here for a moment. So this is a bus stop. And when you're going to present a bus stop, you should present a bus stop in Britain. This is a bus stop in Great Britain with the British very nicely queuing up in line and being very civilized there. And why am I showing this picture? Well, because what determines the length of a bus stop queue? Well, what determines the length is at what rate are people arriving? So let's say 100 people are arriving at this particular bus stop every hour. And then at what rate are people departing, getting on a bus? So let's say only 80 people are departing from this bus stop every hour. Well, if that's the case, then what happens to the length of the queue? Well, every hour, the queue length grows by 20 people. So after 1 hour, you have 20 people. So you started with no queue at all, but with this situation, with 100 people arriving every hour and only 80 departing, after 1 hour, you have 20 people waiting in line. After 2 hours, you have 40 people waiting in line. After 3 hours, you have 60 people waiting in line, and so on. So this queue is growing very, very rapidly. And here is the important thing to understand. The bus stop is the atmosphere. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that there are two ways, first of all, to work on the bus stop queue. I'm going to go back and sort of, before explaining the relationship to the atmosphere, I'm going to just explain the two ways we can make the bus stop queue be shorter. One way is we can make it so that fewer people are arriving. So if we want less than 100 people to arrive every hour, we need to give them other options. We might ask them to work from home, or we might make it better to walk or to ride your bicycle or take the train. And then we can also have another way of making the queue shorter, which is we can send more buses or bigger buses, or we can add taxis that pick people up at the bus stop. And the interesting thing is here, because we can work on both, we don't actually need to make super, super crazy massive changes. So for example, if we reduce the arrival rate to 80 people down from 100, so that's a 20% reduction in the arrival rate. And let's say at the same time, we can increase the departure rate from 80 to 100. So that's a 25% increase. Now, all of a sudden, we have 100 people an hour departing and only 80 people an hour arriving. And all of a sudden, our queue is going to shrink just as rapidly as it grew. So it's going to go after 1 hour, if it starts at 60, after 1 hour, it's going to go down to 40. After another hour, it's going to go down to 20. And then it's going to be gone. And so the important thing to understand here is, even though we have a lot of people going through the system, a lot of people arriving, a lot of people departing, the changes that we need to make in order to impact the length of the queue weren't so dramatic. It was a 20% change in one direction, 25% change in the other direction, and it got rid of the queue. We didn't have to get rid of all the people going to the bus stop. That's the important part. There's still 80 people an hour arriving at the bus stop. Okay, so now let me make this analogy. The atmosphere is the bus stop for greenhouse gases. And as we will see in a second in a variety of charts, the reason the atmosphere is a bus stop for greenhouse gases is because there are greenhouse gases arriving and departing from the atmosphere at all times. And they're part of big systems in which we have what's called sources. That's where new greenhouse gases arrive from, and sinks. That's where they disappear to. And it's only the imbalance between the sources and the sink that adds to the atmosphere. Just like it was the imbalance between the number of people arriving at the bus stop and the number of people departing that determined the length of the queue. So these incredible spikes in the atmospheric concentration of CO2 and methane, these are the queue in the atmosphere of greenhouse gases growing much longer. Why? Because we've increased the sources and we haven't matched the sinks to it. And so that means that when we think about solutions to the climate crisis, when we think about how are we going to get these queues that have built up, how are we going to shorten them and bring them down, back down to the pre-industrial levels, we have two options, and we need to work on both of them. Option one is decrease the arrival rate. That means reduce emissions, put less stuff up there. But we also have option two, increase the departure rate. Bigger buses, we can grow absorption of greenhouse gases, and that's often also referred to as drawdown. So we're going to go through this for both methane and for carbon dioxide. Okay, so I'm not going to discuss this chart in detail, but you can find it on Wikipedia. And it is a chart that shows the sources and sinks of methane. And this is over a 10-year period from 2008 to 2017. On the left-hand side, you can see methane going into the atmosphere. And on the right-hand side, you can see methane disappearing from the atmosphere. And the key thing here is I have taken this data from this chart and I've compressed it into an even simpler chart. And this is the simpler chart. So over a 10-year period, we had 576 gigatons of methane going up, and we had 556 coming down. That means we grew the Q length by 20. And what we want to be doing is we want to be reversing this process, right? So we want to go to, instead of positive 20, we want to go to negative 20. And what does that mean? Well, it means if we could emit 3.5% less, so that's the 20, that's the net balance over how much we're emitting total, and reduce by 3.5% roughly, we would be going from adding 20 to taking 20 out. And conversely, if we just work on one side of this equation, if we just work on the emission side, instead of reducing this by 20, we need to reduce it by 40. So we can work, the important thing to keep in mind, we can work on either one of these bars. And solutions can speak to either side, or maybe in some cases to both sides. And the goal is to change the net balance to go from a positive 20, adding methane to the atmosphere, to a negative 20, drawing methane out of the atmosphere effectively. So now, the interesting part about methane is that it's actually looking like a pretty good story, something we can really tackle. Why is that? Because let's take a look at this bar on the left, the 576 that are going up. Turns out that more than half, basically 2/3 of that is human activity. So 2/3 of the methane going up into the atmosphere is directly a result of our activity. And then there's 30% that comes from wetlands, and wetlands include swamps and all sorts of other things that are emitting methane. And then there's about 6% from other natural processes. But almost 2/3 are from human caused processes. So it means we've got a lot to work with. Okay. What does that human activity look like? Well, here too, there's actually pretty good news, because two sources that are human caused account together for roughly half of this. So if you think about 60% human caused, and then just two causes make up half of that. So 30% of the entire thing going up, 30% we have control over. And remember, I said we only need to reduce this by 7% in order to flip the Q from growing longer to growing shorter. So there we've got a lot to work with, and this is very exciting. So I'm going to dive into each of those two a little bit. So the first one is enteric fermentation. You might be, what is enteric fermentation? Well, this is where enteric fermentation takes place. It takes place inside the rumen, which is the digestive system of cows. And this happens when cows are grazing on pastures and they eat grass. Because what happens is inside the rumen, there's a digestive process that breaks down the grass and generates methane, which the cows then belch out. And as you saw from that earlier chart, that accounts for basically a quarter of all the human caused methane. Now I'm saying human caused because we humans have made it so that there are way, way, way more cows and way bigger cows than there would have ever been otherwise in the natural system. And we have done that because we drink cow milk and we eat beef. So this brings us to a couple of different ways of tackling this part of the methane emissions. And there really are two things we can do. We can have fewer cows, and we can reduce the methane per cow. The total methane from cows is number of cows times methane per cow. Pretty simple equation. So how could we have fewer cows? Well, we can change our diet, could become vegetarian, stop drinking milk. I have to admit, I love beef and I love milk, so this is very hard for me. Probably not really doable, maybe, but hard. We could potentially switch to clean meat and clean dairy. So what that means is plant-based substitutes. So, you could have like a nut milk, for example, or soy milk. These have also a bit of a carbon footprint, so it's not like a clean, totally clean solution. And then people are also working on lab-grown substitutes. So people are literally working on growing beef without a cow in a vat. People are working on growing milk in a vat without a cow. All of these things are are in the works, but they are also some time away, especially the sort of lab-grown substitutes. The plant-based substitutes are in stores now. You can have a Beyond Burger, Impossible Burger. But keep in mind, those also have a non-trivial carbon footprint, as it turns out. The second thing we can do, though, and this is particularly exciting because it could happen quite rapidly, is we could reduce the methane per cow. And there's some companies that are working on literally putting like a little nozzle on the cows that will oxidize the methane as it emerges, as it gets belched out. I think it looks very cute, but I have a feeling it's going to be costly and the cows are not going to like it. But it turns out there's another very promising solution, which are feed additives for cows. So it turns out that when you give the cows certain things to eat, you change what happens in their rumen, and you can reduce the amount of methane they belched out. And there are now companies that can reduce the methane by 50%, some of them maybe even by 80%. And so if you just put those numbers together from earlier, if we could take all the cows and reduce their methane output by 80%, that would be 80% of the sort of quarter of the 60%. So you need to multiply all that out, and then just trust me that that actually almost gets us to reverting the methane balance already by itself, if we just did this and we did it globally and we did it correctly. So that's pretty promising. The second big source, you saw there were two big sources. One was enteric fermentation. The other is the oil and gas industry. This is in Ohio, and it's not that long ago. And this is a well in Ohio, and you can see things are clearly not going well at this well. There is a massive outgassing, and you can see just from the black here, there was also a lot of other oil or tar that got thrown up. And this single outgassing put as much methane in the air as so other countries do the entire country in a year. And this happened over the space of a few days, basically. So that's bad. It's really bad. There's some good news, though, which is we can discover these things from space now. So we have enough satellites up there, and those satellites can actually see methane, even though methane from the ground is largely invisible. And the gray stuff that you could see in the picture wasn't the methane, that was just stuff coming along with the methane. But we can see methane from space. And this is actually the same outbreak that I just showed you in that very dramatic picture. This is the same outbreak seen from space. You can sort of see a massive plume that's sort of drifting to the north and then eventually to the east here over Pennsylvania. And so that's important because it gives us some options here for what to do. So again, when faced with these things, there's sort of two ways to go. One is we could just reduce oil and gas usage, which we should definitely do. And we can talk about some of the ways of doing that: more solar, more wind, maybe geothermal, maybe nuclear. But we also can work on reducing methane leakage. And the way we can do this is to have better monitoring from space, to discover these things when they happen, and to also, by even telling people that we're going to discover when it happens to them, we can give them stronger incentives to avoid it in the first place. And a lot of this comes down to better maintenance, better crew training, better equipment. There's a lot of different things that can go into reducing blowout risk. And these very large methane leaks basically are the results of well blowouts. So here too, there's a lot that can be done. And again, if you take this sort of methane leaks from the oil and gas industry, which again was about a quarter of all the human caused methane that's going in the atmosphere, basically 80+% of this comes from these kind of massive well leaks. There's smaller parts that come from tank leaks and pipeline leaks and so forth, but these kind of blowouts account for the bulk of it. So that's good news. There's a lot we can do, and it should give you some idea of how to use this framework of sources and sinks, and really thinking about what the big levers are to look at methane. We're now going to do the same to look at CO2. And so the carbon cycle is depicted here. Again, the amazing Wikipedia provides this image. And you can see there's a lot going on. There's something called the air-sea gas exchange. And you can sort of see there's some largish numbers here. So there's 90 gigatons coming out of the sea, 92 gigatons going into the sea. So there's a net ocean uptake at the moment. You can look over here and you can see photosynthesis taking down 123 gigatons. Plant respiration, so plants don't just release oxygen, they also sometimes release CO2, releasing 60 gigatons. Then you can see decomposition. This is when your leaves in your backyard rot. That's releasing 60 gigatons. That gives you a net terrestrial uptake every year of 3 gigatons. And then human activity is kind of putting 9 gigatons up into the air, and all of this nets out to 4. So I've done the same thing that I did before. I took the numbers from this graph, and I'm representing them in this very, very simplified image. So we have 220 going up, 215 going down. By the way, just a small footnote, the data on the methane was over a 10-year period. This is a 1-year period here. And so at first blush, this looks really, really promising, right? Because remember, we have a net arrival rate in the air queue of 5 gigatons per year. So our air queue is getting longer by 5 gigatons a year. And all we have to do is turn that from +5 to -5. So it kind of looks like all we need to do is change this by less than 2.5% over here and 2.5% here, or maybe 5% here, or maybe 5% here. And so you might go, well, that should be doable. It was 7% on the methane, and we found that like in no time at all. We like 2 things. If we do that, and we're good on methane. Unfortunately, I am sorry to say, the story on CO2 is not nearly as good. And why is that? Well, if you look at that big gray arrow of stuff going up into the atmosphere, of that huge gray arrow, only 4% is human-made. Now, that compares with 60% on the methane side. So we had 60% to work with easily, and here we have 4% to work with easily. That's a much bigger problem. And so again, this is simply taking basically this bar that you saw here, this gray bar, and breaking it down by where does this stuff come from. And so this is human activity. Now I'm going to take human activity and break human activity further down. And human activity globally looks something roughly like this. So there's some good news here because human activity has some big chunks in it. And the 2 biggest chunks are, interestingly enough, again, agriculture. Here, that's the blue wedge on the bottom left here. And then the green wedge up here is electricity production. So that's our power plants, and heat production. That's how we heat our homes, our offices, our buildings generally. And then another big chunk here is this orange sort of slice up in the top right here. That's transportation, industry. These are industrial processes like making steel, for example. So again, there's some big areas here. Now, I want to for a second talk about one of these. So again, this is taking a further breakdown. So this is taking the orange piece in the top right here and breaking it down further. And the orange piece consists of passengers on the road. This is cars, motorcycles, buses, taxis. It includes road freight. This is everything that's on a truck. And then it includes aviation and shipping. And I'm pointing all this out because one of the things that people love to do is they love to say, well, if just the rich people would stop flying, everything would be great. And as you can maybe guess from these numbers here, something is wrong with that story, right? So aviation is 11% of transport. It's 11% of transport. So if you look at all of CO2 going into the atmosphere, human activity is 4% of that. Transportation is 14% of that. Aviation is 12% of that. Air travel is 81% of that. So of everything going up, it's 0.05%. And even just of basically the human stuff, it's 80% of 12% of 14%, which turns out to be about 1%. So aviation, much as we're like, oh man, aviation sucks and puts up a lot of CO2, in the big picture, it actually, unfortunately, doesn't, because that might be relatively easy to fix, but it's not. So what does this mean? Does it mean we should ignore air travel? Absolutely not. We should absolutely, it's one of the activities we can control, and so we should do things about it. And we can make short distance air travel, we can make it electric. People are building electric planes. For transatlantic flights, we can use fuel that's made from plants, kerosene made from plants. We can possibly build hydrogen-powered long-haul planes. So we can do something about it. But it also means that all the campaigns that are sort of doing the flight shaming and the vilifying of flying are probably not that conducive, because at the end of the day, this is 1.3% of human cost CO2 emissions. Okay, with that out of the way, and I'm just saying this because I love to fly to places, so this is entirely self-serving. What are some of the highest impact solutions we could provide? And I'm not going to go in detail through all of these, but they are derived from the same line of thinking, which is, okay, what are the big sources that we can attack? But in the case of CO2, we also have to start thinking about some of the big sinks that we can maybe grow. So I'll mention some of these here. So adoption of regenerative agriculture techniques, for example, no-till farming. So instead of plowing the fields, you keep the earth, the soil closed at all times. And that means more CO2 is stuck in the soil and doesn't get re-released into the atmosphere. So that's an example of increasing a sink. Another example of increasing a sink is massive reforestation, afforestation, and of course, reducing deforestation in the first place. So less burning down of forests. Burning down a forest, by the way, doesn't just happen in Brazil. It happens here in the US, as we saw this last season through massive forest fires. So wherever we have a forest fire, we need to go back and try and reseed trees as quickly as we possibly can. And we also can take certain areas, for instance, in the US, some of the areas in the Midwest that are kind of marginal farmland could actually be turned back into forests. Then on the emission side, huge opportunities to take road transportation. If you remember that transportation bar a second ago, air travel was only 11%. The bulk of it was road, passenger travel and road transportation. So that's a big one. If you have good enough memory, the earlier pie chart, one of the biggest areas was the electric grid. And then it included home heating and office heating. So electrification of heating is a very important one. And of course, we need to take all the coal and gas power out of our grid. And that's going to require doubling down on solar and wind. But there are also things like geothermal that we need to add, because as we can see in Texas, you want to have a very, very broad mix of energy generation assets on your grid, because any one can fail in sometimes predictable, but sometimes unpredictable ways. So this entire list here at the top are all known solutions that we just need to do a lot more of. And then in the bottom here, I'm mentioning some examples of solutions that are much more speculative, but that are very much worth exploring. So one example of this here is scaled ocean kelp farming. So kelp is the fastest growing biomass on Earth. So for example, on Wally Farms, we have cornfields. The cornfields will grow like 7 tons an acre, for example. Kelp can grow 100 tons per acre of ocean. So that's a big difference, more than a 10x factor of difference. And if you take that kelp and then you just cut it off and you let it sink to the ocean floor, all the carbon in this basically just gets compressed by the weight of the water and just stays at the bottom of the ocean. There's something known as ocean alkalinity management, which maybe I'll explain if there's a question. Enhanced weathering, there's some really interesting thoughts around enhanced weathering. That's basically, there's natural occurring rocks, for instance, certain types of basalt rocks that have the ability to absorb a lot of CO2 from the air. And if you take those and you crush them and spread them out over a bigger area, they absorb a lot more CO2 a lot faster. And then people are also working on something called direct air capture technologies, which are basically physical, chemical, but human constructed systems that remove CO2 from the atmosphere. These fall in the more sort of speculative set of solutions. So part of the story here is on methane, we have a pretty clear pathway how to reverse our queue. We have a pretty clear pathway with only working on 2 major areas, which is cows and oil and gas, to reverse the methane accumulation in the atmosphere. With CO2, we're going to have to do a lot of things. And we're going to have to basically do them all because, as you saw earlier, we control only 4% of a rather large process. And so we're going to have to basically do something with this entire 4%, which is not at all the case on the methane side, where we control much of the methane that goes into the atmosphere. So I'm coming to the end here, and we're going to do Q&A. But a quick preview of what part 3 will be about. Part 3 will be about, okay, so what's the role of activism? What's the role of government? What's the role of entrepreneurship in bringing about all these solutions? That's going to come, I think, another month or so from now. And with that, we will go to Q&A. And I think I'm going to, let's see, I'm going to keep the screen share up. So no, actually, I'm going to stop screen sharing so we can see each other better. So I'm going to go ahead with that.
Great, thanks, Albert. That was great. So if folks want to chime in or put questions in the chat, that would be great. But feel free to chime in.
I have a question.
Oh, go ahead.
I'm actually interested to hear more about ocean alkalinity. A little bit.
So the major rivers of the Earth they often flow over lime rocks, and they take some of that lime rock and they carry it into the ocean. And that contributes to the alkalinity of the ocean, and it lets the ocean absorb more CO2. And so one of the things that we could do is we could take lime rock, crush it, and spread it in the ocean. So basically accelerate a naturally occurring process. And that's actually, the estimates are that this alone, this one thing, if we did it at certain scale, could take about an extra gigaton of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And if you remember the chart, we're net adding about 5 gigatons. So that's a very meaningful bit if we can make it work.
Thank you.
I have a question. Why is the government so reticent to employ nuclear energy as a major resource for solving the problem?
That's a great question, and I'll try to give a quick answer now, and then maybe make that part of the longer discussion of the role of government in part 3. But a lot of it has to do with the fear of radiation, and the fear of radiation has a rational component. So if you're exposed to enough radiation, it's very bad for you. But it also has an irrational component in that the people are in fact exposed to a lot of radiation. Every time you go take an X-ray, every time you take an international flight, if you live in a home that has some amount of radon in it, your microwave oven does it to a degree depending on how well shielded it is. And so what has happened is that there's been a lot of fears about radiation and how to manage radioactive substances. And some of that, of course, also comes from the association with nuclear bombs and the ability to use certain types of radioactive materials for making bombs. All of this is a way of saying that the regulatory regime around nuclear has been largely guided by fear, and fear is often not a very good guide. We just put a small nuclear reactor on Mars. People may not recognize this or know this, but the latest Mars rover is nuclear powered. We can make nuclear reactors that are so small that we can put them on a rover and shoot them to Mars. We can certainly make quite safe nuclear reactors for use on Earth here, and we should probably be doing more of that. And I'm happy to talk more about that on the next time, or even now if people want to hear more about that. But yes, we can and should be doing more with nuclear for sure.
Thank you.
Do you know who this is? You just talked about Mars. Do you know who Mars is?
Who is Mars?
You know the person Mars? You know Mars and Ares? You know those people?
I'm not sure. Is there a question there, Neo?
Do you know who I am? You know who you're speaking with? This is Jesus Christ. This is Alexander the Great.
It's our friendly Zoom bomber.
Yeah, exactly.
Everybody deserves a friendly Zoom bomber. I mean, not everybody gets Jesus Christ as their Zoom bomber, to be fair. So.
Alexander the Great.
Or Alexander the Great, or both in one person.
All right, moving on.
Quick question. You were talking about feed for cattle that reduces methane emissions. Just wondering, what is that?
Yes, okay. That's a great question. So people are pursuing 3 different strategies on this. There's a strategy of pursuing nutraceuticals. So for example, there is something in garlic that when you feed it to cows, it reduces the amount of methane. Then people are pursuing kelp itself again. So it turns out kelp, when you add it to cow feed, it reduces it. And then there are people working on really trying to come up with basically a probiotic formulation for cows to really fundamentally rearrange the biome in the rumen. The rumen contains some very old bacteria, and they actually belong to a different family called the Archaea. And there are people working on how to sort of rearrange that so that cows release less methane. One of the important things is most of the milk cows are fed corn, and cows that are fed corn actually don't produce a lot of methane. It is actually the grass-fed cows that produce the methane, which is unfortunate because we all like to eat grass-fed beef and drink grass-fed milk, but that's actually where the methane from the
I
cows
thought
comes
we
from.
were doing a good thing.
I know, so close and yet so far.
Yeah, I have a question.
Go for it, Andy.
Yeah, so as I see the problem, there is a consumer's side. So what do you think about changing the consuming behavior of end users? So how this can impact the big picture?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's in each of these areas, changing consumption patterns will have an impact, right? So if consumers, for example, find electric vehicles more desirable than cars with internal combustion engines, that's an important change. Historically, it's quite difficult to achieve those kind of changes in the absence of also providing some kind of regulatory change. So a lot of the next part 3 will be about the kind of regulatory changes. So, for example, taxing gasoline more heavily. I grew up in Europe, where gasoline is much more heavily taxed, and so the average consumption per car in Europe was already much lower. And it's a way that the government can drive a bigger price wedge between internal combustion engines and EVs. Now, the good news on EVs, for example, is that their total cost of ownership has already come down so far that they're cheaper to own than a gasoline-powered car. And so by and large, I believe that many of the behavior changes need to be driven by some kind of either price advantage of the alternative solution or by the government making the existing solution more expensive by adding a tax to it. Because large-scale behavior change on short time period, which is really what we need, kind of requires some degree of regulatory intervention. So I think it's very hard. For instance, we could all become vegetarians tomorrow and stop drinking milk, and that would have a huge impact. I just think the likelihood of that happening, even if people, proselytize the benefits of being a vegetarian, I think the likelihood of that happening is extremely low.
One short
Sure.
question. Yeah. So for example, I'm thinking.
By the way, this could be a multi-way discussion. Other people should feel free to jump in. This doesn't need to be a one-way discussion. So sorry, go ahead, Andy.
Yeah. I would like actually several more examples, but I'm thinking of processes like eating sugar or smoking, for example. So historically, there were much more people who smoke, and because of informational campaign for the several decades, the amount of people who smoke decreased significantly. So do you have...
it's definitely possible, and I think that vegetarianism has been growing also strictly on informational campaigns. I just think that our timeline here is such that we need sort of change in the next 5 to 10 years, and I think that kind of level of change is hard to do strictly on an informational campaign.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
There's a question about batteries. Should we be worried about demand for rare component elements and disposal recycling?
No. So I think obviously, as with all scaled industrial processes and with all source materials, there are issues of labor and ancillary environmental damages, right? So some of these rare earths are mined in open pit mining with poorly protected labor and so forth. So there's definitely issues there. But I think these issues shouldn't and cannot stop us right now. I'm not saying let's not fix those issues, but those issues are somewhat similar to ocean plastics. Ocean plastics are super annoying. They're a big problem for ocean wildlife, but they're not going to kill us all. Whereas the climate crisis will kill us all. And so I'm not trying to be sort of cold-hearted and dismissive of this. But overall, I think some of the concerns where people are like, well, we shouldn't be doing batteries because batteries involve open pit mining. I think we're a little past that in terms of the degree of the problem that we've gotten ourselves into. Now, one other criticism is people say, oh, we're going to run out of these rare earths. And I think that's extremely, extremely unlikely. We've never really run out of anything like this because there tends to be a lot of it. And once the price goes up, people start looking for it. And then we tend to find a lot more of it. And also for anything that we actually don't find a lot more, that's where we get actually good at recycling. So all the stuff you put into recycling, none of it gets recycled except for one thing, and that's aluminum. Why? Because that's really expensive to make. And so when you find it in recycling, it's easy to recycle. And so I think that, so the concern that we're going to run out of rare earths, I think there's some geopolitical concerns, which is that China has been much more strategic about rare earths than we have for a long period of time. And China has basically secured some of the better known, more easily accessible rare earth supplies, which is why also China is one of the biggest suppliers of batteries. About 60% of all batteries in the world today come out of China. So I'm not trying to say that there are no issues, but I think all the issues that there are around batteries are solvable issues, and we need batteries, and we need a lot of them. We need them badly.
Other questions? Momo.
Yeah, so I feel like looking back to what you were talking about the methane, like the whole better monitoring from space seems just like a low-hanging fruit for government to execute. Is the technology already out there?
Yes.
Like, where's the missing link? Is it just the willingness to do it?
No, it's a great question. So there are a large number of satellites already in space, and it's that can monitor methane from space. And the resolution is getting better and better. There is now technology where you can pinpoint a methane leak from space at 10 square meter resolution. So you can really be like, yeah, it's your well. We can see it from space. You go fix it, or we will find you a lot of money. So this is a clear example, as Momo, as you just put it, where we just need government to step up and say, look, if your well blows out, we're going to find you, $1 million a day, $10 million a day, whatever, some absurdly large number, which is appropriate, so that people will prevent blowouts from the first place. If they know that we can see them from space the second they happen. So this is a clear example of where we have all the pieces in place. It's just a question of the government standing up against the oil and gas industry and saying, guys, this is just not acceptable. We just can't do it.
I have a political question. If the United States hypothetically were to go on the path of trying to ameliorate the situation with the climate crisis, we're a relatively geographically small country compared to Russia or China, and in combining all the countries of Europe and the rest of the world, even though it would make some improvement, how in effect could we, force other countries to cooperate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, thankfully, we have rejoined the Paris Accord as of a day or so ago. There is a global accord where countries have committed themselves to cutting their gases. Of all the CO2 that's in the sort of human-caused CO2 that's in the atmosphere, above the pre-industrial baseline, half of it was put up there by the US because we've had such a huge energy footprint on a per citizen basis. It's true that we only have 300 odd million people living here, but we've lived so large for such a long time that we've actually put half the CO2 up. Now, today going forward, a lot of it is coming from places like India and China, and the place that is the biggest concern is India, because China has found complete religion on the climate crisis. So China has, for example, really shot ahead on EV deployment. They're not really in most major Chinese cities. You can't get a car with
No,
a
I'm listening to Albert.
combustion engine.
Oh,
So, so India is the big one outstanding. But even India, which I follow closely for that reason, even India has really started to step up on this. So I think people have recognized that it's one global atmosphere that's totally interconnected, and India has recognized now that India is actually, given its geographic location, suffering the most from the climate crisis, the earliest. There's parts of India already today where in the summer the temperatures and the humidity combine to a degree where you cannot survive outside. So I'm pretty optimistic, and coming back to your question about politics, I think, it's just a question of everybody has to do it. And if you want to be a country that's, I think, well regarded by the world, or that wants to even play a leadership role in the world, you have to lead on this issue.
There's a question about bushes and wildfires, whether they're net contributor to climate change, or does the regrowth extract it to make it neutral? That's from, again, James Stewart.
Yeah, that's a really, really excellent question. So the fire releases a lot in a very concentrated period of time, and the regrowth sucks it down over many years. And so if you can get enough regrowth going, you can recapture everything over some time period. The challenge has been that we've had a net loss of forest going on for quite some time. And at present rates, there's a very real concern, for instance, that in the West, we just won't have any forest, period. I mean, we're just losing at a rate much faster, and reforestation efforts are really, really difficult. The good news is there are some companies that are trying to tackle that. There's a company called Drone Seed, for example, that is literally doing what the name suggests. They're dropping seeds from drones. That may be a scalable way of reforestation, especially after large fires, especially after fires the type we get in places like Colorado, where the terrain is very rocky, very hard for humans to go in there and plant seedlings. And so what Drone Seed does is it doesn't actually drop raw seed, which if anybody knows anything about forest, dropping a raw seed on forest floor is not a good recipe for it to grow. Because of a lot of competition on the ground. Instead, they have developed a system of what they call pucks. And the pucks contain multiple seeds in basically a package that's there to protect the pucks. So for instance, they add certain spices and smells to keep like small animals away from trying to eat the seeds. So yeah, but yes, in theory, the forest ecosystem always regrows itself. But because whenever stuff burns down, often you also, in addition to it not regrowing fast enough, we have other things encroaching because we've already disturbed the ecosystem so much. We don't often get forest to regrow. We just get other stuff like grasses or things to regrow, not a forest. There's a pretty shocking number, which is in the last 100 years, we have destroyed as much forest on Earth as in the 9,000 years before that.
It's crazy. Other questions? I think, Andy, you had one before.
It was actually the same Momo asked.
I had a question. Am I on mute? Nope.
Nope.
So ocean vegetation, going back to what you're saying about kelp and having a 10 times tonnage per acre, if you're to cut that and it sinks to the bottom and you continually do that, is the pressure keeping the decomposition at the bottom of the floor and not letting that those gases rise?
Yeah, that's right. So, but that's why you have to do it in the open ocean past the continental shelf, because it has to sink very deep for that to take effect. Anything that decomposes in the sort of top layers of the ocean, all that CO2 is released. And of course, not all of it, because if you took physics in high school or college, you may remember that there's sort of a gas pressure equation. If you've got, actually, you don't have to take any of this. If you've ever opened a bottle of carbonated beverage, you know how the carbon is kind of in the beverage, and then when you open the bottle, it fizzes out, right? Well, the reason it was staying in was because that little bit of air that's in the bottle had a huge amount of CO2 in it, enough so that no more CO2 wanted to come out of the water. When you open the bottle, that CO2 at the top goes out, and now all of a sudden more CO2 from the liquid is released. So the oceans hold a lot of CO2. How much of that gets released is determined by the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere above it. But basically, you have to get below, I think it's like 400 or maybe even 800 meters before the CO2 actually just gets compacted down by the pressure of the water.
Great, thank you.
As far as I know, it also depends on the temperature. So
yes,
with
absolutely.
Temperature of the ocean, of the water, is like the upper layer is growing.
Yeah, in fact, we have benefited greatly. I mean, humanity has gotten very, very lucky. We've gotten very lucky because the ocean cycle, which was that right side of that image from Wikipedia, that cycle has actually stored more CO2 in the oceans than was previously thought. And there's a researcher at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute who has gone around the world and collected a huge amount of data that shows that the oceans have absorbed more CO2 than was previously thought. That's a good news, bad news scenario. It's good news because it means we would be even further behind if it hadn't been for this. But it also means that our accounting was probably off and that we're probably emitting more than we thought, because we were sort of measuring what's actually staying in the atmosphere. We're going, well, it can't be so bad in terms of our emissions, but we had overlooked that the basically ocean sink was stronger than we thought. And so it means that we are actually probably emitting more than we thought we were emitting. It's all doable though. We just got to actually start doing it. We have the power, as they say.
Well, I guess that's just why I wanted to kind of second what Andy brought up before. I understand we don't have a lot of time, but so few people break it down as simply as you do. And I think there's a lot of things out there that consumers could easily, or behavior that could be easily adopted if it were explained a little bit more realistically. Like, you don't have to become a vegetarian. Like, how much less meat do you have to eat? Like, milk alternatives. Like, I feel like if people understood some simple steps that they could take a little bit better than they do now, that would be, I think, a big part of it. Most people wanting to help just don't know how.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And Susan and I are supporting an effort out of Brooklyn called Climate Neutral, which is a product labeling effort. So, you can go in the store and pick up any product today, and you, like, especially in the grocery store, and you can see how many calories it has, and what the fat contents are, and so forth. But there isn't a similar labeling requirement around carbon footprint, and it's pretty clear that if that came, that it would empower consumers to make more informed choices. And so Climate Neutral is doing this, working with certain brands, Patagonia and others, that are doing this on a voluntary basis. But eventually this model could and should probably be mandatory.
There's a question again from James, who thanks you for your excellent answers. Can company startups get paid for removal of CO2 gases at the moment, and can plant a lot of kelp off Australia, off the continental shelf, if there's a revenue model?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that's something I'm going to go into a great deal more detail in part 3, which is basically right now there are some mandatory carbon markets and some voluntary carbon markets. Until quite recently, the prices in these markets were around $8 a ton of carbon. And that is very little money, as it turns out. Now, in the last year or so, the European carbon market has actually gone up to $40 a ton. But where we really need to get to is $100 a ton. So ideally, we get to a place where if you emit a ton, you have to pay $100. And if you draw down a ton, you get paid $100. And that would make this type of kelp farming instantly massively profitable. Because we know we can do this at $50, $60, $70 a ton. So if you could make $100, you'd be making $30 a ton. And people would be building this quite rapidly. So we are getting to a place, some companies, Stripe, for example, the payments company are voluntarily paying as much as $200 a ton in order to get these efforts off the ground. And so that's wonderful. But eventually we need some kind of price of carbon that goes around, you know, $100 or maybe even $150 a ton to really get the level of entrepreneurial activity going that we need to here.
Great. Any last questions?
We have time for one more.
I have one short.
Maybe Lois.
Yeah,
Lois has another question.
You're muted, Lois. And Andy, put your question in the chat.
Is the Biden administration committed to doing anything in terms of like tax benefits for companies like you were just talking about and entrepreneurial efforts?
Well, the Biden administration is definitely a huge step in the right direction over the prior administration. It's not clear that they will go far enough, though, given the timeline. So a lot of what's come out of the Biden administration still uses like 2050 or 2035 as kind of a guidepost, and we need to act a lot faster than that. I think I would sort of cautiously characterize it as steps in the right direction, but not far enough, fast enough for where we need to go. Which is why in part 3, we'll also talk a lot about the ongoing need for climate activism. Climate activism is incredibly important to put more pressure on government to act faster.
Okay, quickly, Andy, what's your last question?
Oh, you're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah, so the question about the speed of carbon extraction, for example, for trees, they like will grow for decades to unfold their potential. So if we have like 5 to 10 years, we should maybe select the most quick ways to.
I mean, if we plant a lot of trees over the next 5 to 10 years, they will. The second a tree starts growing, its entire growth, all of its material, all the carbon for that comes from the air, right? So, yes, as they get bigger, they draw more, but it's eminently reasonable. It's just, you know, it's the old saying: the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. And so, I'm not saying that this tree planting alone, you know, some people like, if we plant 1 trillion trees, it'll solve everything. I think there is no silver bullet. There's no single solution to this problem, but we still should be planting a lot of trees because it'll definitely make a big difference.
Great. All right. It is just the hour. Wanted to thank Albert. You want to take a look, just a moment, said, asked whether climateneutral.org is the one you were talking about.
Yes.
So I wanted to thank everyone for joining. Stay tuned for the part 3. Part 1 is actually also online in our YouTube channel, where we can, if you don't have that link, we can get that to you. And just a big thanks to Albert for doing this climate series. And
my pleasure. I really enjoy putting this together, and so thank you all for listening to me.
Great. And then also stay tuned for other Spark of Hudson programs that are coming this month and next. So do make sure you get on the newsletter to find out more about it, and follow us on Instagram at Spark of Hudson. So thanks, everyone.
Enjoy the rest of the weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Albert.
Thank you.
Right, bye.
Bye.
I had a question. When's part 3?
Part 3, that's a great question. We're doing one every month. So we're going to plan one for March, or definitely April for Earth Day, but I think we're going to do it every month now.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.